What's the point in having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As the worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happen all too often. A nice-looking website doesn't equate to a successful website, and the truth is your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create you a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice-looking website as well as a successful one. So for a month free, head on over to brightervision.com/Gordon. Again, that's brightervision.com/GORDON. Go check them out today. This is the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, helping you to navigate your private practice journey. This is session number 84 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Hello, folks. I'm Gordon Brewer, and I'm so glad you've joined me for the podcast. If this is your first time listening in, welcome, and hope you'll come back and maybe go back and listen to some older episodes. Got a lot of great information there and just a lot of great guests. So if this is your first time, go back and listen to some of the older episodes, and also be sure to subscribe to the podcast. I'm glad that you found me here. For those of you that are coming back, as I've always said, I hope this information is helpful for you, and I hope that it's helpful for you in your private practice journey. You know, this morning I got up and had my coffee and got out to do my walking. I've managed to go 2 weeks now walking consistently, so I'm a little bit proud of myself for doing that. I had gotten, as I mentioned in last week's episode, I'd gotten into some bad habits around exercise and just all of that, and so it was so great to get out this morning. The air was crisp and cool, and it felt like fall almost, but real unusual for us here in East Tennessee in June. We do, even though we're in the mountains, we're in the Appalachian Mountains, it tends to cool off at night, but not this cool. It got down in the 40s last night. So this morning, it just was so refreshing to get out. And I love listening, speaking of podcasts, I love listening to podcasts. And it's really how I learn so much. There's, in addition to other private practice, or topics around private practice like this podcast, I also listen to a lot of other kind of business-oriented podcasts, and some of them that I really like are one is called Smart Passive Income and that's a guy by the name of Pat Flynn, and he's one that I really recommend on if you're interested in learning how to do kind of some online marketing, online business kind of endeavors like I'm doing right here with the Practice of Therapy. That's a great starting place and a great place to learn. Some of the others that I listen to, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, the Story Brand podcast with Donald Miller. That's an excellent one to learn about marketing and that sort of thing. So, but anyway, there's just, the whole reason I started this podcast is because I realized that this medium, this platform is something that is growing, and so many more people are listening to podcasts now. So anyway, glad you're here listening to this. Obviously, it's so important to me to have people that follow, and I just am so grateful to you for following me and being part of this journey with me. Today on this episode, I'm going to be talking about a question that I've gotten a lot here lately. And so I figured, since several people have asked me kind of a similar question, I figured I better do an episode on the podcast here just to answer some of those questions. But in particular, it's around hiring employees or hiring contractors and how to pay them. So I'm going to be getting into that here in the program today, or in the podcast today. And so we'll get to that here in a minute. One thing I wanted to let you know about, and this is kind of a somewhat big announcement, is I'm going to be doing a free masterclass July 12th, depending on when you're listening to this, July 12th, 2019. And it's going to be called Knowing Your Numbers. And in that masterclass slash webinar, I'm going to be talking with people about how to look at their finances and how to understand their numbers. And so I'm so excited to be doing this and looking forward to I'm getting it all together here. Was working on it some yesterday, getting this the PowerPoint slides. They're not boring PowerPoint slides, hopefully, but I'm just going to be talking about ways to think about the financial side of private practice and what you need to know, some of the basics around what you need to know in order to make your private practice profitable and sustainable and be in it for the long haul, just from a financial standpoint. It's all stuff that I've kind of learned along the way, and some of it I've kind of learned the long way. One week before last, and I think it's episode number 82 when I had Julie Harris. And one of the things that she said was one of the number one mistakes that she saw as an accountant working with therapists is that they didn't know their numbers. And one of the things that I also know is that most of us just don't know how to look at our numbers and know what to look for, and just really thinking about the financial side. So this masterclass is there to help you with that. You can go over to practiceoftherapy.com/knowing your numbers. I know that's a long URL, but that's where you'll find the registration for the webinar, and I hope you will join me for that. And I'm hopefully going to be doing several more in a series just around this topic, around the financial side of private practice. As you know, I've been promoting my full course, which just really goes in depth into this whole topic, and that's available to you. It's at practiceoftherapy.com/money matters. And the name of the course is Money Matters in Private Practice. So again, I commend that to you. And I know you hear a lot about me about that, but I put a ton of work into that. And so I'm going to unashamedly promote it. So I commend that to you. So again, today in this episode, I'm going to be talking with you about hiring employees and just and employees and contractors and how you pay them and that sort of thing, and what I've learned along the way. There are any number of reasons that people will decide to make the move to start a group practice, and not going to go into a lot of the different models of group practices in this. One of the most downloaded or most read blog posts that I've got on the website has to do with that particular topic, or just business models in private practice. But one of the things I want to concentrate today on this podcast or just the big thing is just how do you pay people and how you decide on what sort of compensation you want to give them when you do go to hire people to work in your practices, either as a therapist or as administrative people, that sort of thing. Because it really is, once you kind of scale to that point, or that's really the big motivation that most people have in starting a group practice, is that they're at that point where they realize that there's only so much they can do in terms of the number of clients they can see individually, or they maybe have created a wait list already, and they want to have people to refer to where they can also benefit from it financially. And those are the big motivations that most people have for starting a group practice. Typically, there are two different ways you can go about hiring people. One is just hiring them as an employee, and then they report to you directly, and you are their boss, and you set their hours, and you give them some sort of compensation for being there to be a therapist with or administrative assistant or whatever their title or their job is. Then you pay them for doing that job. The other model that you hear a lot about, and again, it's going to vary from state to state as to whether or not they allow you to do this other thing, and that is hiring somebody as a contractor. Typically, we hear, those of us here in the United States, especially, we refer to those as 1099 contractors, and 1099 just refers to the type of tax form that you give them at the end of the year. And so there are advantages and disadvantages to both ways of hiring people. When I first started a group practice, I hired people as contractors, and it is a great model for having people on board. The advantages of being a contractor is that there's really kind of less paperwork and less oversight on your part when you hire somebody as a contractor. In other words, you don't have to worry about the withholding of income tax or withholding of Medicare, Social Security, all of those kinds of things, because the contractor is responsible for doing that on their own. And the other thing about having someone as a contractor is that they are really kind of operating as a separate business entity from your practice. Now, they might be operating under your brand, but you, from a tax standpoint and also from an oversight standpoint, you have to be more hands-off with a contractor. And the IRS is very specific about that. One mistake that a lot of people make is that they hire people as contractors, but they end up treating them as if they're employees. So be familiar with that, and also be familiar with your state laws around that. There are some states, the one that comes to mind for me off the top of my head, that states that don't allow you, because of their licensing and that sort of thing, don't allow you to hire somebody as a contractor for your practice. You have to strictly hire them as an employee, and the ramifications of that, are just, you have to just be careful about that, and certainly talk to someone that's an employment expert or person in your particular state, just to make sure you're aware of those things. The employee, as I mentioned, employees are different in that when you hire somebody as an employee, you do have the oversight. They report to you directly. When you pay them, you have to do withholding. You have to, in many cases, you have to also provide for pay for unemployment insurance. You also have to, in some states, have to provide some sort of workman's comp insurance and things like that. So again, be familiar with your laws of looking at the different ways of doing this. Now, I will say that hiring somebody as a contractor is simpler. It is less paperwork. It's less that you have to do on your end as a private practice owner. But because it's simpler doesn't necessarily mean that it's better for you in your practice. I think I had shared earlier, but at the beginning of this year, 2019, I made a big shift in the way that I handle my people. I switched them from being contractors to employees. And I'll explain a little bit more later about why I did that. But the big reason why I did that is I started looking at my numbers and understanding my numbers and what it cost me to keep them on and what I was paying them. And it was a better deal for the business to switch them over to being employees, not only from a profitable standpoint, but also from a tax write-off standpoint. So again, just knowing those things are real important. So the big question that gets asked a lot and this is really what prompted me to do this episode, is how do you know what to pay people, and how do you know how to pay people for them being in your practice? So let me break it down into, really there's 4 different categories of this, and at least in the way I think about it. One is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about each of these. One is the fee split. So in other words, if you collect from a client, your practice takes a fee from a client, then you split that with the therapist that actually saw the client. And the typical split for most places, and this is just on average, is like a 50-50 split. Some places do like a 60-40 split. The therapist keeps 60%. The practice keeps 40%. And there are some that are very generous and go all the way up to like a 70-30 split. And so that's one way of compensating people. And another way to compensate people is to do what I like to refer to as just a flat rate per session. In other words, you have an agreed to amount that you're going to pay them per session, per clinical hour, that sort of thing. The other way, of course, is just kind of a traditional way, in that you pay them an hourly rate for the hours that they work. And it's just, if they're in the office during those, if they clock in and clock out, and so then you pay them whatever per hour, whether it be like $20 per hour or $10 an hour, or whatever the rate is. And then the fourth way, of course, is just a salary, and that's typically how most professionals tend to be paid a salary, or expect to be paid a salary from just whatever it's agreed to. Again, the way that you choose to compensate people is going to depend on, number one, the size of your practice. Number two, having looked at your numbers, of understanding what it costs to have somebody on board as an employee or a contractor. Also, just knowing what your overhead or what the costs are for your practice. Also, there are some maybe some ethical things you have to think about. For example, one thing that comes up a lot, and I want to kind of give my 2 cents worth on this, because I've heard from some people, and it might be in some of the codes of ethics, they discourage doing a fee split when you hire somebody as a therapist. Here's my thought on that. Regardless of whether you pay somebody a percentage of each session, or whether you pay them a flat rate per session, or whether you pay them an hourly rate for just the hours that they work, or if you pay them a salary, all of them, when it comes down to it, are fee splits. In other words, you're collecting a certain amount from a client, or from a patient, from a customer, and then that is coming to your business, and then you pay out from that your employees, your contractors, your people. And so in order for the practice to stay open and for it to stay afloat, it's got to make a profit. So you really have to keep part of that fee that is collected. So in essence, all of these compensation plans are fee splits, if you think about it that way. That's just my 2 cents worth on that. So let's talk a little bit about the percentage way of doing fee splits. So typically, a lot of times, usually the percentage method, or the percentage way of doing fee splits, works better for contractors than maybe for some of the other ways of doing things. And typically the way a fee split is done for most businesses or most practices is that the money you pay out, it's only paid out after you have collected it from the client. And this was particularly a good method of doing this is if you're on insurance panels or accepting insurance, because as we know, unfortunately, with insurance, there's a delay in getting paid. You don't get paid the day of the session, except maybe with copays or whatever. But you have to wait for those claims to be filed, for the insurance company to transfer the money or send you a check or whatever, however it is they pay you. So typically with a fee split, whether it's a 50-50 split or 60-40 or 70-30, most of the time the way those things are done with a contract is that with the understanding that you pay the therapist when you get paid. And so that's a typical fee split kind of model. The flat rate, again, it's a fee split thing, but it's a set amount rather than a percentage of what is collected. So typically with a flat rate, that works well when you've maybe got employees. It also can work well with contractors. So typically what happens is that, say you collect, you collect whatever per session, say $100 per session, and then you pay that therapist $50 per session. And it might be that, for example, if you're on insurance panels, you might only get $85 per session or $60 per session. You still pay that therapist your agreed to flat rate. Now, again, I'm just making those numbers up. Because you've got to take in consideration your cost, your overhead, and what percentage of that session rate goes to those things. So that's what I meant earlier when I said know your numbers. So the other ways of paying, of course, just strictly an hourly rate. So if somebody comes in and works 8 hours that day, you pay them at an hourly rate. And that might, it could be, $15, $20 per hour that you pay them for the time that they're there, regardless of whether they're seeing clients or not. You pay them for the time that they are working in your business. That's a very traditional way of compensating people. And then the final one is you just give them a salary per year. The typical salary, I just say it's interesting. The average salary, at least as of now, for counselors and therapists, social workers, just mental health providers, excluding psychiatrists, is around, I saw this statistic the other day, around $43,000 a year. So depending on where you live in the country, that may or may not be a great salary, but that's just a ballpark idea of what sort of salary ranges people are typically getting. So again, how you decide to compensate people, a lot is going to depend on your numbers and what you need to get in order for you to make a profit as a practice owner, but also to be able to cover your costs, pay your taxes, all of that sort of thing. So that's why it's so important to really kind of crunch some numbers on the front end to kind of figure out what it is that you can afford to pay people for their services if they come to work for you. One other idea that I'll throw out there, and again, this is something I do in my own practice, is I have originally when I had contractors and I paid them a percentage of what was collected, I based that percentage on the volume for that month. So if they brought in, again, I'm just making up hypothetical numbers. If they brought in $1,000 or less, I paid them, did like a 50-50 split. And once they got over $1,000, but maybe were less than $3,000, I moved it up to a 60-40 split. And then if they brought in, say, over $4,000 or $5,000 per month, again, these are hypothetical percentages, I switched it to a 70-30 split. And so again, if you think about it, you're still going to get the benefit of the increasing amounts that you're getting per month, but also you're going to be able to reward your people and incentivize them by giving them a higher percentage because they've brought in more volume. The same can be done with the flat rate. And again, that's what I've done in my practice. Again, I'm just using hypothetical figures here. So if for example, they see an average of 10 clients per week, so 40 clients or less for that month, they get $30 per clinical hour per session. And then if they go over 40, then maybe it bumps up to say $33 per session, and then so forth. So, you've got to run the numbers, and you've got to also understand what your average per session revenue is, and also what it costs you per session to keep your doors open, to provide a place, that sort of thing. The hourly rate that I mentioned is pretty straightforward. Again, you've got to know what you can afford in your practice in terms of being able to pay them that hourly rate. The other thing that and Julie Harris and I in episode number 82, session number 82, talked about this. One of the things when you set your rates or your percentages or your flat rates or however you choose to do it, keep in mind you want to be able to build in some bonuses and maybe some other incentives. If you wanted to give somebody a raise, you've got to know how to do that. And so it might be that you work out with each individual therapist just kind of what their rates are. One of the workarounds that I figured out for this in my own practice is that I've got levels of therapists. I've got my interns that I pay a certain rate, which is kind of the lower end of the rate. And then I have a level 1 therapist. And so that's a person that is maybe more newly licensed, and they haven't really gotten the volume of clients yet that they want to have. But there's an incentive for them to be able to stick it out with the company or stick it out with the practice, that once they've been with the company or with the practice for 2 years, then they have the opportunity to move up to be a level 2 therapist, which are higher rates across the board. So again, it's all based on the numbers. It's all based on what I know what our average revenue is per session, what the average cost per session is, and all of that sort of thing. So know your numbers, crunch your numbers, and figure out what's going to be profitable and equitable, and then also pay people fairly. One thing I will say, and you might, this is kind of common sense to some degree, but if you pay people per clinical hour, one of the things that you've got to be able to do is justify the fact that they're going to also be doing work outside just sitting in sessions. And so what you pay them needs to be high enough to where if they were to switch to an hourly rate based on the time that they put in, is that it's going to be higher than the minimum wage. So that's, again, something you have to think about in terms of what you pay a person per session. Typically with professionals such as therapists, doctors, therapists, those of us in this field are considered what they consider exempt employees. And that's just a term that the IRS just kind of allows for in terms of somebody being a professional. So it's like if you've ever worked someplace where they paid you a salary instead of an hourly rate, you're considered an exempt employee. And so, again, therapists, professionals are really kind of considered exempt employees. They don't, whether they work 40 hours a week or 60 hours a week, they still get paid the same. And so that's kind of the workaround with that. Another thing you have to take in consideration, especially if you're going to be hiring people as employees, is, what sort of benefits are you going to offer in your practice? One of the big reasons that I switched over to my people from being contractors to employees is I wanted to be able to offer some benefits. So things like health insurance, things like profit sharing plan, those kinds of things, workman's compensation, insurance, that kind of thing. And so you have to be able to build those things into your costs as well. And that's why it's, again, so important for you to know your numbers and know what you can expect to get per session and then calculate it out from there. The other thing I'll mention real quickly here about maybe doing a flat rate per session where you actually pay them for the sessions they've done without necessarily depending on what you've collected so far, is you do need to have some money in reserve in order to do that. And so typically, like I've mentioned before, it's a good idea to have a buffer and a financial buffer anyway, just to cover your costs and cover your expenses and pay yourself and that sort of thing. For at least, 2 months minimum. More is even better, I would say, around that financial buffer. But if you're doing a flat rate and you're paying people after they have done, provided the services, regardless of whether you've been paid or not, obviously you've got to have the money in reserve to do that. So one of the things, again, is to do your numbers, to know what you need to have on hand. When I made that switch at the beginning of the year from contractors and employees, I had kind of a dip in revenue because I was having to pay my, or rather a dip in my profits because I was having to pay my people kind of out of pocket until I got paid by the insurance companies. Again, I had done the numbers. I knew that it would work out, but I had to have that money in reserve in order to pay my people. Well, again, I know that was a lot of information, but just to recap, again, the things that you need to think about in hiring people or being able to have, deciding on, first of all, whether you want to go with an employee model or a contractor model. Neither one is right or wrong. Contractor is simpler. You have less paperwork to worry about in terms of filing taxes and that sort of thing. Typically, the compensation for contractors is typically a fee split or a flat rate per session that you pay them. Again, do your numbers so you know what is a better deal. The fee split is typically paid out once you collect the money and is not necessarily when the session is completed. The flat rate is typically paid out when the session is completed. Again, the flat rate model, you need to have some money in reserve to do that. But it's either one. You need to just know your numbers and know what's going to be more profitable and equitable for you and your practice. And again, the other two ways to pay people is just simply an hourly, a flat, straight hourly rate. If they work 8 hours that day, whether they're seeing clients or not, you pay them for those 8 hours based on whatever that hourly wage is. And then finally, the other one, and again, is just paying somebody a salary. Again, depending on how you do your numbers is going to have an effect on how you do that. And like I said, in some states, you might be a little more restricted in how you can pay people. But all of it, as I said in the beginning, is a fee split because you keep a portion of what is collected. And so it's a matter of how you decide to kind of divvy that up. So hopefully, folks, this has been helpful information for you, and I hope that I hope there was a little bit of clarity to that. I know that this whole topic of what to pay people can be kind of complicated, and like I've said in other episodes, there's no exactly right way to do it. You do what works for you in your practice. And the other thing too is to give yourself permission to be creative about this. There's lots of different ways you can go about this, but the main things you want to be concerned about are that you're following your state laws and following federal laws around, minimum wage, about what it means for a person to be an employee versus a contractor. And so you want to know all of that stuff. So again, I'm going to have hopefully some examples in the show notes of some of these things, and also some links to some blog articles and other information where I talk about this particular topic. So again, hopefully this has all been helpful for you. Well, folks, I hope that this information has been helpful for you in just thinking about hiring people and the difference between employees and contractors and how you pay them, and different pay structures for paying people for the services they provide. I think it's important. One of the great things about being in private practice is that as we grow, we also not only reap the benefit of having a profession and a job that pays us well, but also we help others with doing that too, by providing a place to work and a place for them to practice, do their practice. One thing I did want to mention real quickly before we close out, that I didn't mention in the podcast, is with all of these things, particularly with contractors and employees, make sure you have some sort of signed agreement with them. That might be a no-brainer for some, but one of the things you want to do when you hire contractors or employees is have a written agreement with them. With a contractor, you have to have a contract. And so, again, that's just kind of common sense. But also with employees, you need to have an employee agreement. And what I would suggest you do is definitely talk to an employment expert in your area. Most states on their websites have great resources for that. Certainly the IRS website has got some information on that in terms of what's allowed and not allowed in terms of employees versus contractors. But do check with an expert in your area, because the laws from state to state can vary. Usually accountants are really good resources for that, but also in most towns there are attorneys that specialize in employment law. And so you want to just check that out and maybe have a conversation with them. Do check out our sponsor for today's show, Brighter Vision, and you can go check them out at brightervision.com/Gordon. And if you sign up using that link, you can get 1 month free for their services. Brighter Vision not only can help you build a beautiful website, they'll also do all of the back end work and help you with all the things that you need to do in order to make sure your website is found, particularly that SEO, search engine optimization, which is so crucial in making sure a website performs well and that people can find you on the internet. So go check that out. Also, be sure and sign up for the free masterclass webinar that's coming up. Knowing your numbers. Talked a lot about that today in this podcast. And so in this particular masterclass and webinar, which is a free thing for you, when you sign up. I'm going to kind of go over and we'll go into more specifics about how to know your numbers and things that you need to look at, those KPIs like key performance indicators, and maybe show you some examples of how to calculate things and think about things. So I commend that to you. And that can be found at practiceoftherapy.com/knowingyournumbers. It's a long URL, but again, there'll be a link to that here in the show summary and the show notes. So take care, folks. I do hope that the rest of your week, the rest of your weekend, whenever you might be listening to this, is a good one. And be sure and subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it, whether it be on iTunes is going away, by the way. I didn't talk about that, I don't think. But anyway, it's going away. So Spotify is a good one. Apple Podcast is what it's switching to, iTunes. Google Play, Google Podcast, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, though, just to name a few. Those are places you can find the podcast. It's most anywhere now, even on Amazon Alexa. I think you can get the podcast there. Just say, "Hey, Alexa, play the Practice of Therapy podcast." It should come up for you. Try it out. Take care, folks. Hope you have a good rest of your week. Been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer. Please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com for more information, resources, and tools to help you in starting, building, and growing your private practice. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to receive the free private practice startup guide at practiceoftherapy.com. The information in this podcast is intended to be accurate and authoritative concerning the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, or producers are rendering legal, accounting, or clinical advice. If you need a professional, you should find the right person for that.